The air inside New York City's most prestigious corporate headquarters was thick with tension. Job interviews were being held in a sleek, ultra-modern conference room where young applicants sat nervously, clutching their resumes. At the far end of the room, a well-dressed young man in his mid-20s was seated across from Nathan Sterling, the company's powerful CEO. Sterling was known for his extreme liberal stance, openly stating that his company had no room for right-wing fanatics. The young applicant, Jason Carter, had done everything right. Top grades, an Ivy League degree, internships at leading firms. He was the perfect candidate. But something was about to go horribly wrong. Sterling casually flipped through Jason's resume, then suddenly froze. His eyes locked onto something that made his expression twist in disgust. With a slow smirk, he placed the resume face down on the table and leaned forward. "Jason, I see here that you interned at the Trump Organization." The room went silent. Jason nodded, his confidence unwavering. "Yes, sir." "It was an incredible experience." Sterling's smirk widened. "Incredible? That's an interesting choice of words. Tell me, Jason, are you a Trump supporter?" Jason hesitated. He could already feel where this was going, but he refused to lie. "Yes, sir, I believe in conservative values and—" Sterling abruptly raised a hand. "Stop, that's all I needed to hear." He picked up Jason's resume, dramatically ripping it in half right in front of him. "We don't hire Trump supporters here. You're dismissed." A stunned silence filled the room. The other applicants gasped. Jason's heart pounded, but he remained composed. Then, before he could even stand up, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. A tall, striking figure stepped inside. Barron Trump. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, his presence was undeniable. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. "But did I just hear you correctly?" Sterling blinked in surprise. The entire room turned to look at Barron. And just like that, the real showdown had begun. The tension in the room was suffocating. The applicants, the assistants, even the executives passing by in the hallway, everyone had stopped what they were doing. Nathan Sterling, the liberal CEO, slowly turned his chair toward Barron Trump, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, look who decided to show up." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "A Trump trying to lecture me about business ethics. This should be entertaining." Barron remained completely calm, his icy blue eyes locked on Sterling. "Let me get this straight," Barron said, stepping forward. "You're rejecting an incredibly qualified candidate, not because of his skills, but because he once worked for my family?" Sterling smirked, leaning back in his chair. "That's exactly right. We don't hire people with extremist views." Barron raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly makes Jason an extremist? His belief in free markets, lower taxes, hard work?" Sterling's smugness didn't waver. "Oh, please. Don't act naive, Barron. Trump supporters believe in America first. But let's be real, your father's policies were disastrous. I don't need people like that poisoning my company culture." A few of the younger employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jason, still seated, clenched his fists under the table. Barron took a slow, measured step forward. "So let me get this straight." He gestured around the luxurious office. "You built this company in a country that guarantees freedom of speech, yet you punish people for their political beliefs." Sterling chuckled, shaking his head. No, you conservatives always twist things. This is a private company. I can hire and fire whoever I want." Barron smirked slightly. "Oh, so you only believe in free speech when it benefits you." The room fell silent. Sterling's jaw tightened. He was used to running interviews like a dictator. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone with Barron's confidence and intelligence. "You don't get it, Barron," Sterling sneered. "The business world has moved on from your father's outdated, racist, bigoted ideology. We hire progressive thinkers here. People who want to build a future, not cling to the past." Barron's expression didn't change. He simply folded his arms. So you only hire people who think exactly like you? Sterling hesitated, his smirk faltering for just a second. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said, Barron countered. And do you know what that makes you? The entire room held its breath. Sterling's own employees were now watching him, waiting for his response. For the first time in the conversation, he had no comeback. Nathan Sterling's smug grin was gone. The room was completely silent, all eyes fixed on Barron Trump, who stood firm and unshaken. You only hire people who think like you, Barron repeated, his voice calm but razor-sharp. You punish those with different views. And yet, you call my father the dictator? Sterling scoffed, trying to mask his discomfort. Don't twist my words, Barron. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. I have a responsibility to ensure a safe and inclusive work environment. Hiring a Trump supporter? That's like inviting a ticking time bomb into my company. A few of his assistants exchanged nervous glances. The CEO had just said the quiet part out loud. Barron raised an eyebrow. A ticking time bomb? His tone was one of pure disbelief. You mean like the millions of Americans who voted for my father? The people who build businesses, serve in the military, and pay the taxes that fund the infrastructure you use every day? Sterling rolled his eyes, attempting to regain control. Oh, give me a break. Trump supporters are aggressive, entitled, and unwilling to accept progress. Look at January 6th. Barron immediately cut him off. Ah, there it is. He smirked. The moment when every liberal like you runs out of arguments and hides behind the same overused talking points. Sterling's jaw visibly clenched. January 6th was a riot, Barron continued. A terrible moment in history. But if we're going to talk about political violence, let's not forget the peaceful protests of 2020, where entire city blocks were burned to the ground, small businesses were looted, and innocent people were beaten in the streets. Or does that kind of destruction not count because it wasn't done by conservatives? Sterling's face turned red. That's completely different. He snapped. Those protests were about social justice. Oh, so violence is okay when you agree with the cause? Barron didn't blink. Fascinating. A stunned silence filled the room. A few employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some were even nodding slightly, realizing Barron was making sense. Jason, the job applicant, sat there in disbelief. This wasn't just an argument anymore, it was a total dismantling. Sterling slammed his hand on the desk, furious. You know what, Barron? I don't have time for this. I run a billion-dollar company. You and your father can whine about cancel culture all you want, but this is my office. My rules. Barron smiled slightly. That's fine. You can run your company however you like. He gestured toward Jason. Just like Jason should have the right to believe in whatever he wants without losing an opportunity he's worked hard for. Sterling huffed, looking toward security. This conversation is over, but Barron wasn't done yet. No, Mr. Sterling, he said, taking one last step forward. You just proved my point. Nathan Sterling leaned back in his chair, but his confidence was slipping. The entire room was watching him now. Even his own employees seemed less sure about their boss's stance. Barron Trump, standing tall and collected, let the silence linger for a moment. He wanted Sterling to feel it. You don't hire Trump supporters. Got it. Barron's voice was calm, almost conversational. But tell me, Mr. Sterling, if Jason had lied to you today, if he had hidden his beliefs, would he have gotten the job? Sterling scoffed, rolling his eyes. Oh, come on. If someone needs to lie about their values to fit into my company, then clearly they don't belong here. Barron smirked. Right, so your company isn't really about diversity, is it? Sterling's jaw tightened slightly. Of course we are. We celebrate diversity. No, you don't, Barron countered immediately. You celebrate people who think exactly like you. There's a difference. A few employees shifted in their seats, stealing glances at each other. Sterling let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. Oh, please, cry me a river, Barron. Conservatives aren't some oppressed group. You all act like you're victims, but you're just mad that the world is changing. Barron's expression didn't waver. Nobody here is playing the victim. We're talking about fairness. Sterling leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Fairness? Life isn't fair, kid. Do you think anyone gave me a fair shot when I started this company? No, I had to fight for everything. Just like Jason will have to fight. If he doesn't like my rules, he can go start his own damn business. Barron tilted his head slightly, watching Sterling carefully. You know, you're right about one thing, Sterling smirked. Of course I am. Life isn't fair, Barron continued. But you don't get to complain about fairness when you're the one rigging the game. Sterling's smirk vanished. What the hell does that mean? Barron gestured toward Jason. Jason put in the work. He earned a degree. He got the experience. He walked in here today prepared to prove himself. But none of that mattered to you, because before he even had a chance, you decided he wasn't worth hiring. And why? Because he believes in America first? Because he respects traditional values? Because he worked for my family? Sterling clenched his jaw but didn't say anything. You don't have a problem with Jason's ability, Barron said, his voice steady. You have a problem with his beliefs. And that's not progressive, that's just another form of discrimination. The room was completely silent now. Even Sterling's own assistants seemed uncomfortable. A few were staring down at their laptops, avoiding eye contact. Sterling huffed, his fingers tapping against the desk. This conversation is over. He turned toward Jason. You're not getting the job. End of story. Barron took a slow step forward, towering over the seated CEO. No, Mr. Sterling, he said quietly. The story isn't over. You just exposed yourself. Nathan Sterling adjusted his tie, trying to regain control. But the room had changed. The air was different now. His employees weren't nodding along anymore. Some looked uneasy. Others stared at their desks, suddenly very interested in their keyboards. A few even exchanged glances, as if silently asking each other, did he really just say that? Barron Trump noticed it all. And he knew exactly how to use it. You say you run a progressive company, Mr. Sterling, Barron said, keeping his voice calm. One that values diversity, inclusion, and fairness. That's right. Sterling leaned back in his chair, arms folded. But what about diversity of thought? Barron asked, gesturing toward the room. Do you value that? Sterling smirked. Oh, please. That's just a conservative talking point. Diversity of thought is just an excuse for bigotry. The moment the words left his mouth, a visible shift happened in the room. A few employees visibly tensed up. One of the assistants, a woman in her early 30s, lowered her head slightly, as if embarrassed by what her boss had just said. Barron caught it. Interesting, he said, turning toward the employees. So let me ask you all something. Sterling's smirk dropped instantly. Nobody is asking my employees anything, he snapped. Barron ignored him. How many of you actually agree with what Mr. Sterling just said? Dead silence. Not a single hand went up. Sterling's jaw clenched. Barron let the silence hang in the air for a moment before he spoke again. So let me get this straight, he said, turning back to the CEO. You claim that hiring Trump supporters would create a toxic work environment. You claim that conservative values are dangerous for your company. That's right. And yet, when I ask your employees, the people who actually work here, whether they agree with you, not one of them speaks up. Sterling's face darkened. That doesn't mean anything, he snapped. They just don't want to get involved in this ridiculous conversation. Barron tilted his head slightly. Or maybe, he said slowly, they just don't want to lose their jobs for having the wrong opinion. The tension in the room was now unbearable. Jason sat completely still, his hands gripping his resume, barely believing what he was witnessing. A few employees glanced at each other again. One man rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable. Another woman bit her lip, shifting in her chair. Sterling saw it too. And for the first time in the conversation, he actually looked nervous. "This meeting is over," he snapped. "Jason, get out." "Barron, I don't care who you are. You don't get to come into my office and lecture me on how to run my business." "I wasn't lecturing you," Barron said smoothly. "I was just exposing you." Sterling shot up from his chair, slamming his hands on the desk. "I said get out." Barron didn't flinch. "All right," he said, stepping back toward the door. "But before I leave, let me ask you one last thing, Mr. Sterling." Sterling exhaled sharply, his hands clenched into fists. "What?" Barron's gaze never wavered. "If your own employees don't even support what you're doing, then who exactly are you doing it for?" Sterling had no answer. The room was dead silent. Barron turned and walked toward the door, but he wasn't finished yet. Nathan Sterling stood frozen, his hands still gripping the desk. His face was tense, his usual smugness completely erased. The silence in the room was deafening. Barron Trump, standing tall and completely unfazed, took one last slow look around. He saw the way Sterling's employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the way no one defended their boss, the way a few even looked down at their desks, pretending to be busy. They weren't just watching this unfold. They were embarrassed for him. "You know what I find funny, Mr. Sterling?" Barron said, his voice calm and measured. Sterling exhaled sharply, trying to keep his composure. "I'm sure you're going to tell me." Barron smirked slightly. "You talk a big game about creating an inclusive, forward-thinking company." "I do," Sterling said through clenched teeth. "And yet, you're afraid of your own employees." A few of them looked up at Barron wide-eyed. Sterling flinched, his eyes flashing with anger. "Excuse me?" Barron didn't blink. "You just watched this entire room refuse to back you up," he said. "And what was your reaction? Did you stop for a second and think, maybe I'm wrong? No. Instead, you got defensive. You lashed out. You screamed at me to leave." Sterling's face was turning red. "I didn't scream," he snapped. "You did," Barron said simply. "And do you know why?" Sterling gritted his teeth, saying nothing. Barron took a slow step toward the door. "Because deep down, you know you're a fraud." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Sterling looked like he had been slapped. His entire body tensed, his fists clenching. "Excuse me?" he growled. Barron turned back to face him. "You pretend to be a champion of progress, but the second someone challenges you, you panic." Sterling's jaw tightened dangerously. "I am not panicking." Barron raised an eyebrow, glancing at Sterling's white-knuckled grip on the desk. "Could have fooled me." A small, barely contained chuckle escaped from one of the employees. Sterling's head snapped toward them. "Something funny, Emily?" he hissed. Emily, a mid-level marketing executive, went pale. No, sir." Barron smirked slightly. "See what I mean? You don't lead with respect, Mr. Sterling. You lead with fear." Sterling turned back to Barron, his entire body trembling with rage. "I said get out." Barron exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Fine, but before I go, let me leave you with one last thought." Sterling crossed his arms, his entire posture screaming defensiveness. "I'm sure I can't wait." Barron took a slow step forward. "You think you're on the right side of history. You think by blacklisting conservatives, by silencing anyone who disagrees with you, you're protecting your company." "That's right," Sterling said quickly. "I am." Barron smiled slightly. "Then why does the room feel like a funeral?" Sterling's eyes flickered. "What?" Barron gestured around. "Look at them. Your employees, your team. You claim you're protecting them, but do they look inspired? Do they look empowered?" Sterling hesitated. His employees remained completely silent. A few glanced at each other. Some looked down at their desks. Nobody spoke. Barron shook his head. "No, they look afraid." afraid to say the wrong thing, afraid to even react. And do you know what that means? Sterling's breathing was getting heavier, his face bright red. It means you're not a leader, Mr. Sterling. Barron took one last step toward the door. You're just another coward pretending to be one. The entire room sucked in a breath. Sterling nearly knocked over his chair as he bolted upright. I said, "I heard you the first time," Barron said smoothly, opening the door. And so did everyone else. With that, he walked out, leaving Sterling standing there, fuming, exposed, and completely alone. Nathan Sterling stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his breath uneven. The room around him felt different now, he could sense it. The authority he once carried, the control he wielded so effortlessly, was slipping through his fingers. His employees weren't nodding in approval, they weren't backing him up. Instead, they sat in uneasy silence, their gazes shifting, their thoughts racing. The air was thick with something he wasn't used to, doubt. He forced a sharp breath, his voice cutting through the tension. "Well, does anyone have anything to say?" His tone was sharp, almost desperate. For a moment, no one responded. Then, slowly, Emily lifted her head. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect." She hesitated, glancing around at her co-workers before exhaling. What if he was right? Sterling's expression darkened instantly. Right about what? Emily swallowed hard. About us, about this company, about the way we treat people. A ripple of unease moved through the room. Sterling's hands curled into fists. Are you kidding me? That was Barron Trump, a privileged conservative rich kid trying to lecture us about fairness. Emily met his gaze, unfazed. But did he lie? His jaw tightened. His fingers tapped against the desk. He looked around the room, but it was clear the hold he once had over them was gone. They weren't just following orders anymore. They were thinking, questioning, and that terrified him more than anything. That evening, whispers spread. Some employees told their friends, some told their families, and some, without Sterling knowing, had recorded the conversation. By the next morning, it was everywhere. People were talking. Articles were being written. Employees who once feared retaliation started speaking up. Some quit. Some filed complaints. And some took their voices to social media, sharing their stories for the world to see. Sterling arrived at the office, expecting to regain control. But before he even stepped through the doors, the board had already called an emergency meeting. Barron Trump, however, was done thinking about it. For him, this wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving a point or celebrating a victory. He had simply done what was right. And as he walked through the streets of New York that morning, the city moving around him, he knew one thing for certain. There would always be another fight. And when it came, he'd be ready. Barron Trump didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. He had stood his ground, spoken the truth, and let the facts speak for themselves. But this moment wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. Across America, people were waking up. They were seeing through the hypocrisy, the double standards, the so-called tolerance that only applied to one side. This wasn't just another debate. This was a battle for fairness, for free speech, for the right to think differently without fear. And if this story proves anything, it's that standing up no matter the pressure, no matter the opposition, still matters. Now I want to hear from you. Was Barron right to call out the hypocrisy? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe in standing up for what's right, make sure to like this video. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that exposes the truth. The fight isn't over, and the next battle? It might be even bigger.